Good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel, and welcome to another DevOps.com webinar. Glad to have everyone joining us today for what I think is going to be one of the best webinars we've done in a long time. We've got some great guests, and it's a great topic. First of all, let me start off by thanking our friends at Plutora for sponsoring today's webinar. These webinars, frankly, they're expensive to do, and we couldn't do them without the help of our generous sponsors. Also, let me thank our two panelists today. Plutora's own Jeff Keys, who's Director of Product Marketing over there. Jeff, welcome.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for having us. This is great.
Absolutely. And a somewhat frequent guest on our DevOps.com webinars and chats, one of the smartest men I know in the DevOps space, Gary Gruver. Gary, welcome back.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for the compliment. I don't know that I'm one of the smartest people you know. I just think I've been making mistakes in this space longer than anybody else. So I've learned more maybe by
That's how you get smart, man. Right? That's how you get smart. Guys, before I turn it over to you, though, I want to just take a quick moment to go over with our audience. We've set aside time for questions today. We really, really would like to see audience participation. So please, we use the GoToWebinar platform. Most of you have the control panel in your upper right-hand corner. If you go to the control panel, you'll see a section marked questions, and if you click the little arrow so it's downward facing or caret, you'll see that section expand. As Gary and Jeff are presenting, questions pop in your mind, don't wait to type them in at the end when we're looking for questions. Type them in real time. You don't have to worry about remembering them. We have a record of them. We'll get to them, and we can, allocate our time appropriately. And it just makes for a much more interactive and better experience for everyone. So please don't hesitate. There are no dumb questions. You get something in, pops in your head, type it in that question section, and we will do our best to get you some answers. If for some reason we get so many questions, but they're in that section, we have a written record of it. We can ask Gary and Jeff and the team to get you out an answer after the fact, even if need be. Lastly, if you look at your control panel section, you'll also see a section marked chat. Here at DevOps.com, we use the chat section for technical issues. So if for some reason the audio cuts out or the slides aren't advancing or anything technically is going wrong, but you can still get to that chat window, please type it in there. We do have engineers standing by, and they will try to help you out with your issues. You could raise your hand, as I just saw someone did, and that's another feature of the GoToWebinar control panel, but frankly, it really doesn't do a lot for you. So ask your questions. If you got a problem, go into chat. With that said, let's get rocking and rolling here. Today's webinars are tips, techniques, and strategies to systematically improve your application delivery. And all kidding aside about Gary being smart or not, I couldn't think of a better person to lead this discussion, nor a better company than Plutora, and Jeff is part of the team there to really lend some real world experiences that they've gathered from servicing and working with dozens and hundreds of customers. So Jeff, Gary, if it's okay, I'd like to see it. Let's get this thing started.
All right, Alan, thanks for the introduction. As I said, I don't know that I'm smarter than anybody else in this space. I just think I've been making mistakes here longer than anybody else has. And it started in 2007 when I took over leading a very large organization in the LaserJet business, trying to transform how we did development of embedded firmware for the LaserJet printers. And it was such a breakthrough for the business that we delivered 2 to 3x improvements in business productivity that I wrote my first book, A Practical Approach to Large-Scale Agile Development. And this was before DevOps had became a term anywhere in the industry. And really what I wanted to do is it'd been such a life-changing experience for me that I wanted to share the ideas and thoughts with as many people as possible to help them down that path. Then I went from there to Macy's.com, right about when the continuous delivery book came out and tried to figure out how to apply some of these same principles that made us successful in HP in a large website type organization that was fundamentally different than embedded. And after 2.5 years there, really started trying to figure out what are all the things that worked at one place, didn't work at the other. What are all the things that I wish I knew before I started leading transformations like this, but I didn't have anywhere to go to ask. And I tried to document my best thinking along that with Tommy Mauser, who'd been with me at both HP and at Macy's, in terms of here's the advice, here's what we think you should think about, here's what you should do so that you could avoid the mistakes that we'd already made. And that was kind of taking the learnings from one and saying, how do I replicate this in another place? And then I left Macy's and started consulting on my own and going into large organizations and helping them figure out how to transform their software development processes. And after a year of that, I figured needed to get much more structured in terms of how we do this and where do we get started on it. And we wrote the Starting and Scaling DevOps in Enterprise. So these transformations have been such a breakthrough for me that I've really been spending a lot of my time and a lot of my effort trying to figure out how do I help everybody in the organizations realize the types of breakthroughs and benefits that I've been able to realize and experience in their organizations.
I think that's where I actually met you, Gary. First was I came across the Starting and Scaling book and was so blown away because it was like all the things you were talking about were things that I had experienced, and it was just kind of funny. I hadn't ever experienced it at the scale you had talked about, so it'd be really easy for a small team to go do something, but quite different. Being a marketing guy, I get to listen and see what all other vendors are doing from a messaging standpoint. It seems like everybody's message is the same. Hey, use our product and we're going to help your delivery be so much faster, so much higher quality. And you know, some of those start to feel like they're stretching the reality of now it's going to, you know, cure my acne and help my teenagers in different ways. But what I loved about the books is that they're so real life and they show what's really going on. This webinar is really exciting for me because I feel like this is the summary of the teachings, and maybe that's really the next step. What is the process that people go through that you know, as you help them to systematically improve their delivery pipelines?
Yeah, I went through it a fair amount in our previous webinar on Starting and Scaling, but really the first step is trying to understand your deployment pipeline. What are the pieces that have to be collectively developed, qualified, and delivered as a system? Because there's tight coupling in your architecture. And in my mind, that's a deployment pipeline. A lot of what you hear about are the small teams that have architected their code bases to where they can move independently. And that's what a lot of organizations can do. But for me, it's a lot of bigger things. So I start with understanding that deployment pipeline. And then I think one of the biggest breakthroughs that started happening is the ability to automate some of the repetitive tasks that we do in software development on an ongoing basis. And I think that's where manufacturing saw some of their breakthroughs, is when they start automating some stuff. Then you can get much more process control. You can know what's going on. So the first step is really build, verify automation for a single node in your deployment pipeline. And then once you get that figured out, then you're going environment to environment, and then you start farming the build acceptance tests, and then you start looking across the entire system and improve the entire deployment pipeline. And that requires being able to get a view of that across the system. But you know, it's hard to figure out where to start, and it's hard to get momentum, and you want to do this in such a way that you're getting some real business results, and you want an approach that's going to work as you try to replicate it across different parts of your organization.
That's exactly right. And that's the part that resonated with me. I know when I look at the industry, what I hear about are these big reports about, you know, really all you need to do is to gather these metrics and so forth that will show how much faster and better you're going to be. The problem is, I think for most organizations, is they're just not there yet. They're not deploying 250 times a day. They're still figuring that out and trying to figure out how to transform from the legacy processes and systems that they've got, both from a cultural, from a planning, a requirements, and everything else. Achieving these kinds of metrics as part of their transformation feels like an end game. Like, well, once you're there, then you can start looking at these kinds of metrics that evaluate your frequency and throughput and so forth, and they're really cool. The other challenge I think that is difficult when you look at some of the metrics that are focused on just code delivery is that there's more waste that goes on in the transformation that's expanding beyond just code check-in. We like to look at that as more of a value stream. When you evaluate the value stream, there's so much more that is being done from the customer perspective on building out the actual products that go on there. And when you get down to it, you have to optimize the entire system of development, not just looking from just the check-in and beyond. I love a Gartner view of it from a recent report where they look at some of the other metrics that you need to produce and gather information from all the different systems, regardless of where they are, to evaluate the effectiveness of the changes that you do. The whole point is at the end of the day, the transformation that you're going to go through is going to get asked a single question by executive and development leadership, which is simply, is it working? And are we doing better than we did before? Without gathering the metrics, you really don't have any knowledge of what you're doing. So with that, you kind of get into the next steps of what Gary's talking about.
Yeah, and what I found works well for me is just analyzing the deployment pipeline and looking at it end to end. Then Jez Humble and David Farley came up with this idea in the continuous delivery book, and it's nothing more than starting with a business idea and passing that on to a developer, getting an environment that you need for testing, moving the code over there for testing, validating that it's ready to be deployed, making the decision to deploy it, move it into production, and then monitoring it to make sure that it's working on an ongoing basis. And the reality is, for small teams, this is a lot about just empowering the team, making sure they have the right resources, getting the bottlenecks in the system out of their way to where they can be productive. And that's a great idea. And these small teams will always move faster and quicker than anybody else in the industry. But I think the area where I have kind of a unique view is, having been an executive who led these transformations, not for the sake of doing DevOps, but for the sake of delivering business results, is that I've tended to work in large organizations that have older architectures that have to figure out how to bring larger number of groups of people together to deliver code on an ongoing basis. And these are the large, tightly coupled systems. And, if possible, if you have a large, tightly coupled system like this, and you can easily get to a loosely coupled system, that's going to be the ideal endpoint and the way to go. But the reality is, for a lot of organizations, that's a hard transformation. And if you start with a large, tightly coupled system like this, you just can't build it, test, deploy it, and test it on a frequent enough basis to get each commit to a small number of developers. And one of the things that we're starting to do and realize is, one of our biggest bottlenecks in the flow as we move through these organizations is just the amount of time that it takes to run all the testing, fix all the defects, and get things out the door. And to do that, we need to get much better at being able to triage and do those types of things. And to do that better triage, what we need to do is break these into subsystems and find as many of the issues and the subcomponents as possible. So as we covered with our earlier starting and scaling webinar with Plutora that's on the DevOps.com website, we talk about how do we break this using service virtualization into subsystems, and then how do we take each of these subsystems and gate each of the components with an automated test where you're catching defects as close to the subsystem A or subsystem B as you can, and then you're building that into subsystem 1 that you've got, and then you make a decision that that's qualified and ready to go. And then the next step is, how do you take that full deployment pipeline and move it through all the different stages? And so it turns into kind of continuous integration of continuous integration, continuous integration of that. And what you're trying to do is use those stoplights as automated tests to gate as many defects as you can as possible from reaching the next stage of the deployment pipeline, so that that stage can stay more stable. And where you find the defect is either easier to debug and triage because it's localized to a smaller group of people. And I think one of the biggest challenges we have is, in a manufacturing environment, you can walk up on the catwalk and you can look at the factory floor and you can see all this. But in software, because it's digital instead of physical, these things are much harder to see, manage, and improve.
Hey Gary, how often in your travels do you see people really having a good understanding of what their deployment pipeline looks like?
It takes a while. You know, I started with this version of it in the group, and when I do my workshops, one of the first things I do is I try to get people to draw the architecture, and then I try to get them to draw out their deployment pipeline. And sometimes it's a struggle. And one of the things I start with asking is like, okay, so you don't have the full deployment. Let's start with you've got an environment called production, right? You've got that, you did that. What do you do before production? And some people have a staging environment, some people have a UAT, some people have a different, but they know what it's called. And then when you start pinging them on, describe the environments in your integrated test environments, that's when I finally start digging out that information. But I'm not sure that many of the organizations, until we really start talking about it, have a good view of how that flows through the organization. And one of the things that I think I do when I come in is I help them, you know, they're so busy just running their process on a day-to-day basis that they don't necessarily take the opportunities to step back and look at it. And one of the things that I do when I come in is try to help them do that. And it takes a while to try to dig out the information and data so that they know what's going on.
Gotcha. So really the first tip and technique here is for folks to come through and draw out their deployment pipeline and be able to draw it out from the time, at least that from that little subsystem, how does it actually flow through into production? What kind of gotchas are people going to run into as they go through this process?
Well, where I usually start is, you know, on this first step, which is let's just take one stage in your deployment pipeline. And I typically recommend people to take the one stage furthest to the right that they have influence in the organization. So if you're in an organization of, you know, 40,000 people, like we're going to be discussing in the next series on this webinar with Ted Ewell, he didn't have control over everything further to the right, but he had pretty good control over his subsystem one. So he started there. But if you are a higher level executive and you do have influence, start as far right in this deployment pipeline as you possibly can, because the improvements you make there will have the broadest impact on the largest number of people in terms of the improvements that you make. And the first thing I do is, you know, one of the things that we're going to use to transform how we do this and gate this is our automated tests. So just take whatever set of automated tests you have, run them 20 times in a row with those automated tests on the same environment, on the same deployment, on the same build, and just run that over and over again. And what I find is most organizations have flakiness in their system somewhere. And we're trying to figure out where. In a lot of cases, it's flakiness in their tests. So the design patterns or the framework that you're using for your tests are unstable. But in other cases, it's a situation where they've got thousands of tests. They're only running them once a week because it takes the rest of the week to debug and triage them because nobody gave the person running automated tests a big enough system. So it's always timing out and running into instability issues. Or you've got a flaky F5 in the system, or you've got any of those other things. You really can't start to transform how you do software development and start to use these automated tests as a signal until you get stability. So you can see across the bottom, all the 0 ones are tests that always pass. All of a sudden, these have become a good candidate for tests to use for the next steps in our test for stability. The ones that are always failing are stable and they're good. In this case, before we add them to the test that we can use, we need to fix the defects that's causing them to fail. And the ones that are going up and down or flaky are a bad signal, and we can't really use them in our process. So we need to quarantine those tests off to the side until they can get fixed and resolved and working on that. So we do that with the tests, and we try to get down to a core set of tests that we think are stable and an environment that's stable. The next thing we do is, you know, that's step one, is just in one environment build. And so the next step is we're going to add deployment to that. So that same version of code that we built, the same environment, we're going to deploy, test, deploy, test, deploy, test. And here we're looking for the same type of information. We're trying to figure out, is there instability in our deployment process? Is it manual and it doesn't happen the same way every time? And if that's the case, then we need to work to get that deployment instability out of it. And that could be automating your deployment, but maybe your deployment problem is not a problem. The next step is we run that same experiment and we add build in there. So is there any instability in the build system that enables you to get going there? And then after that, we're reconfiguring the environment, redeploying the environment, doing a build, doing a deploy, and doing a test, and getting that solidified. And this process of getting all that instability out of the system, working through it and resolving it can take an extended period of time. And I talked that I really like DevOps as a concept because when you force increasing that frequency, it forces you to fix inefficiencies that have existed in your system for years. And that's what we're doing through this process. And as you'll see from Ted in the next series of this webinar, that this has taken him a couple of years to really get that instability out of the system. But as he's done it and he's gone down that path, he started to create some real breakthroughs for the business in the process.
I know in my world, in my previous experience, I can't tell you the number of times that, you know, a flaky test went down as something that the developers had to then go waste time and try to fix when in fact it was a test or it was an environment that wasn't behaving properly. And if only we had, you know, solidified the signals, if you will, to make sure that we were measuring the things in the right ways, we would have, you know, done a lot better and wasted less time.
There are so many things I see that you just couldn't imagine, like the environment being too small, or somebody manually sets up the environment and then somebody wrote a script that overrode it and broke everything and nobody knew it was running.
Yep.
Or endpoints are going down, so you need to mock those out with service virtualization. There's just an endless array of things that are happening in those environments that people are seeing on a day-to-day basis and dealing with them, but they're just muscling their way through because it's on a low frequency. And if we're going to transform how to do development, we're going to have to take these automated steps, automate them, and then make sure that they're really stable and consistent.
Exactly, which really brings to the next point. You know, we saw a little bit in there of looking at the metrics of what's going on. You really can't manage what you don't measure. And I like the additional analogy to it is that you can't continuously improve what you don't measure. I think this is where the story of Plutora comes in here now. But because what we do as a platform is we help you measure. We have a series of modules that integrate into the existing tool chain. And by doing so, we abstract those and normalize that data across the different types of tool sets that exist for delivering software, all the way from the ideation and the LM kind of tools into the test, into the build, the provisioning and operations, all along that entire tool chain to correlate this data together to help that transformation move forward at whatever phase it is and at whatever type of process it's using. Now we have a number of different management kind of capabilities on top of that to help with the coordinating of the idea and feature planning as it relates to the different tools that are already out there from a PPM as well as the lifecycle tools, a release planning to help you coordinate the different portfolio of releases as they'll come through and the different feature sets and the IT resources that are required. You know, here's the environments that are needed, here's the different governance and procedurals, breaking those things down into phases and gates. We have a management layer over the test environments to help give visibility into those different test environments so you don't hit a situation like I did in my past where all my unit tests were failing on a particular build, couldn't get it to succeed, and then found out, oh, someone was running a load test, a very significant load test on the same environment that was basically flaking out everything else we were doing. Deployment coordination orchestration, helping manage and orchestrate the human and manual tasks of cutover into production. And finally, a post-implementation review, which gives the entire process and team ways to capture ideas and changes necessary to feed back into the entire process. What we've done is we've partnered with a strong analytics engine with Tableau to then give rich analytics and knowledge and insights on top of all the data that we gather to give, not just a report and dashboards, but the ability for development leadership to follow their nose through certain problems, which comes to be really critical as you start to investigate areas. It's not just about having a report, it's about having the data over time that you can correlate it versus teams or versus your own historical to, at the end of the day, give you the way to optimize, visualize, and govern the business value flow. Because that, at the end of the day, is what's needed. And all this wraps into a value stream management platform. If you were to take, for example, some of the test metrics of just running unit tests over and over again, one of the visualizations that we can do is the ability to look at those and just say, well, how easy is it to see which tests are failing and which tests are flaky in that particular case? And that gives you the ability to then execute on what Gary's talking about of segmenting out the flaky tests and pushing them to the side. We can also take that and log those from a timing, so you can see, are there particular packages that are taking too long? Are there different areas that maybe we could add more tests into because we don't have enough? You can look at coverage. You can look at really slice and dice your data in different ways. Having a requirements traceability where you can correlate the tests and cover that versus the number of requirements you've got and measure that against criticality, or compare that to defects escaping into production and know how and where to fill things out, which sort of takes us to our next step.
Yeah, I like that a little bit, because what you're really trying to do is you're making the digital factory visible. And exactly. I think that's one of the biggest problems with digital versus physical. So with physical, you can see things, you can see the factory, you can see it coming together. And if we're going to improve the flows and figure out different things, we need to start making that digital factory visible for people to learn about, manage, and figure out where it needs to be improved.
Mm-hmm.
Step 3 in my process is we've taken stage 4 and we've really gone through all those processes of making sure that we don't have instability in our tests, we don't have instability in our deployment, we don't have instability in our build, and we don't have instability in the environment. We've worked through all that. Now we need to take that same process, and if you started in stage 4 because that's your level of influence in the organization, you need to start working that process back upstream, so moving it left. And the idea is, as you test further to the right, what we're really doing is we're inspecting inequality, and Deming's rolling over in his grave. The more we move those automated tests to the left and gate code based on that, is we're getting to the point where we're building quality in versus inspecting it and going through that process. And to do that, we need to make sure that all the upstream environments are just as stable as the one that we just resolved. And a lot of things that we did to resolve the stage 4 environment are going to enable the other ones to be successful, but we need to start working through those stages on a step-by-step basis and going through that process. And we do that by trying to look at the different environments and figure out whether we have code issues or environment issues or test issues or deploy issues, and putting together that view of things across the system. And it's really no more than that exercise that we did, but we'll find different things, and maybe we'll find that subsystem 1 has given us the majority of the defects going into stage, and we'll want to try to start our gating efforts there. But having the data, having the information, and systematically working your way up and down the deployment pipeline to work out the instability is the next step that I typically take in this process.
How difficult has it been in your transformation projects to help people gather these kinds of metrics of, even just source of issue and stage to stage?
I usually start with about 3 or 4 weeks on the phone with customers and clients, trying to, let me see your architecture, give me your environment, and then let's start to collect this data. And after 4 weeks, we've kind of got a gut sense or feel, but it's usually taken them a lot of effort to pull the data. And I tell them, don't worry about getting it to 3 significant digits. If you can get 1 significant digit and everybody in the room in the workshop can come together and look at it and agree on these are the biggest issues, then we can start down the path of improving. And we do that, and we agree that here's what we're going to do in the first month, and then once a month we get together and review what did you get done, what didn't you get done, what did you learn, and what are you going to do next. And it's that process of continuous improvement, and this data helps us start in the right place. But then it's usually difficult for the organizations, once they've made some changes, once they've made some improvements, to go back and collect this data on a very frequent basis, just because for a lot of organizations it's a little manual and it's a little labor intensive.
And I think that's where, that's why this is such a great discussion, because gathering these things on a continuous basis seems like it would have an enormous impact. If once you connect the systems up and then you can gather it, how do you think that would change the conversation as you go forward?
It's going to speed up the ability to see the value, and it's going to, when you go on this transformation, you're asking people to change how they work on a day-to-day basis, and you're asking your management change to give you funding or resources to work on continually improving your process. In this case, one of the most important things you need to do is you need to market those advancements. You need to market the changes, and you need to market the benefits, because if you as a leader that's leading this transformation isn't going to do that, nobody else is. So the more you can show the improvement and then impact that it's had on people's lives, the more they'll embrace the different ways of working, and the more you can show the impact that it's had on the business to your bosses and leaders further up in the organization, the better you're going to do at getting the resources to continue your transformation.
I noticed something else, Gary, that you haven't really prescribed a particular technology or solution for any subsystem or stage in terms of a vendor for automation or test or environments. Just thought that was interesting. Can you comment on that? Is it critical to have everything be in the same technology, the same automation tool, or the same requirements tracking?
I don't feel that strongly about that. Ideally, if this is a deployment pipeline and all these applications built into subsystems, built into a larger system need to come together and work together, I think that team should all be using the same tools and processes as much as possible. But if it's in a large organization and it's a different part of the organization, yeah, you can force them to use a tool. What I've typically found is that if you let the team pick which tool they're going to use, they'll make it work and they'll overcome things, because a lot of tools are out there that are making a lot of this easier and a lot more successful, but some of these tools, they all have little quirks or different things, and if the team gets to pick it, they'll overlook the quirks and really see the value and focus in on providing that. And if you force it on them, they're more likely to just see the quirks and not really focus on the value. So I tend to let them pick, and I'm kind of culturally, here's how you transform, how you do it. There's a lot of great tools out there. You guys provide great tools. Other people provide great tools out in the system. And I kind of see myself as trying to help people figure out how to transform and be able to be successful with the tools that are out there in the industry.
Absolutely. And I think we see the same thing too, which is, I think part of the power of why we have this conversation is to say, use whatever tools make sense for each team. And, you can use a tool like Plutora to actually interconnect all these different systems and teams to not only correlate the data, but give you an overall view independent of whatever tool they're using, and better connect them and better help them collaborate together. Meanwhile, they're free to choose whatever tools that they're using and move forward and continue that transformation. So I know you talked too about measuring some of the timings of this.
I was going to pass on this slide. Just
oh, that's right. So part of the management of environment to environment, you quickly come into the next conversation of, well, gosh, these environments are really challenging. There's been a push to think of environments as purely something that are spun up and spun down and completely on demand. What we find in some of our, well, in fact, in the majority of our customers, is that the majority of the environments that are being worked on in the test environments world are not on demand or even automated. and how do you integrate with that? How do you work with that? My example of running a certain set of tests, and yet somebody else was using it for a load test that kind of blew everything up. How do you actually know that that's going on? Well, one of the management modules that Plutora offers is around handling test environments, which, as we find, has been one of the flakiest areas of the whole deployment pipeline and has caused many a developer angst and challenges as they try to go debug their code or their build process, only to find out that there's something flaky in the environment itself. Our test environment management module is a management solution on top of the environments themselves, allowing the operations teams to help enable environments that are utilized by the dev teams. They can actually create a self-service environment where the dev teams can come in and request an environment for a particular time. They have a catalog of capabilities that those environments can provide. And then it's up to that environment management team to actually ensure configuration, test data, and so forth of whatever's needed for that kind of environment that's being asked for. What it does by abstracting this away and offering a layer on top is give you ultimately visibility in what's happening with your test environments. You get utilization, they can manage chargebacks, they can look at impacts and know really what's happening from team to team on any one environment. As these things get spun up and spun down, they can control the metal underneath to ensure that it's reliable and, frankly, agile. They can look at utilization and plan for the future as they know what's coming. And certainly they can prevent that load test from impacting another kind of thing, another kind of test that's going on. Ultimately, as teams get smaller and smaller and more autonomous, the collisions that they find themselves in looking for test environments start to increase, and this has caused a lot of challenges. And so we give the ability by offering it's a really simple solution of managing these test environments, integrating all the way in from how it's provisioned into cloud provisioning, integrating that into the CI world, and improving that enormously. We find actually that the typical ROI for implementing a test environment management solution is on the order of just a few months because of the gains of time saved back to the dev and test teams. Once there, you're able to do some really cool stuff. This is a screenshot from our pipeline view where you can look at the different environments and look at the applications that are currently on it. You can kind of put together, well, here's the flow of a particular kind of release. Let me look at it from an environment point of view to look at, maybe what's on my demo environment is the oldest, most stable version, but as I reach back to the left, I can see newer versions coming, and I can start to get a feel of, am I ready to release what's coming, and how reliable will that be as it goes forward. I can drill into any particular project and start to see some of the changes that are there. If I want to roll that forward, I can actually get into the actual file changes there. As a test and a release team, able to do a lot deeper inspection without jumping and having to figure out, well, which Jenkins instance is here, or what other CI tool is over here that's got what builds on it, and trying to debug that and acting more like a plumber trying to figure out how do I find each piece. It gives that kind of visibility into the environments themselves. And all this kind of takes us to the next step in your process, Gary.
And my next step is really what I call farming the build acceptance test. And if you look at this view of your deployment pipeline, what you're trying to do is find and fix as many of the resources many of the defects as far left on the system as you can. And you really want to get away from this inspect and fix quality in later mentality that we've gotten to in software and trying to build it in. And if we wait till late in this deployment pipeline to find our defects, and we're inspecting and we're entering a defect and we're going through that process, it's a slow, laborious process of basically having a manufacturing line and just building up a bunch of inventory and then just spending, whatever we call our hardening cycle to go through just reworking and fixing all the automobiles so they can actually be shipped to the customer. And we want to build that in, but we don't want to do it with the overhead of having to assign a defect to it. And how we do this is we improve stability over time by changing these gates that we use, the stoplight that really shows where we are stopping defects from getting into the system, and then we go through each of these stages. And then what here is this is regression. So you're running as many of the tests at least once a day as you can. And if we go back to this, what we're looking at is a view of here are all the different components in the system, and we're looking at regression. And what we found is that something on this day, and I know for a fact because this is LaserJet data, this is the fax test. Somebody checked something in that broke the fax test that wasn't caught by the build acceptance test. So we go in here and we look at this test that was broken, and instead of going in and filing a defect for all these tests that failed, what we do is we fix the defect in the system, and we go and add one of these tests out of this group back to the build acceptance test, and we use that to gate our quality and make sure we're getting quality on an ongoing basis. You're basically needing to be able to graphically look at the data of your tests and statistically manage it to figure out how to improve the stability over time. And you need to label all of your tests correctly to enable you to triage and figure this out quickly, but you also need a tool that enables you to visualize it so you can take things that were showing up on the right side of the graph and catch them with automated tests more to the left side of the graph and actually gate them so they don't cause instability further down the system.
That's right. So that really takes us to the next step of once you're gating all that, you have to start looking at, frankly, the entire system. And when you look at the entire system, you've got to start evaluating the process of application delivery from beginning to end. You've got multiple pipelines that you're working with. You've got other areas that are beyond just the check-in, which gets into how you're doing planning, how you're doing discovery and the idea management. Where is the times being spent for governance, and how is this actually moving forward? Are there ways that you can reduce that work in progress to focus on just the work that's going to be inbound? How much further towards Agile and DevOps kind of practices can you take, and can you start setting goals about reducing some of the, eliminating the wait times between processes? And maybe, Gary, this takes us really as you start to understand the work.
Yeah, this is, we've got the environment stable, we've got the gates good, we've got the automated tests, we got the deployment pipeline automated and working. We're trying to release on a more frequent basis. But what I typically find is culturally, your organization hasn't changed yet. And you've got, in every release, it seems like you've got something that the business wants really bad. Have you ever noticed how when the business wants something really bad, that's usually how they get it in terms of quality and requirements and different things? And on here, what you can see is on this specific release, as we went into release branch, what we did is we took 10% of the stories that really weren't ready, and we took them out of the system on release branch day. And because they were the ones that were bad, we dropped our number of defects dramatically, increased our passing rate, and increased the number of stories that were ready to get out the door, which is the things you're trying to do in the end game. And what you start to realize is you're never going to release more frequently unless you change that behavior of pushing stuff in that's not ready. And you need to help the organization understand that when you push that stuff in that's not ready, what you're really doing is holding the rest of the release hostage to go with the slowest leg item. And instead of that, if we can take the stuff that's not ready, put it in the next release, we can start releasing it on a more frequent basis and getting things out the door much more regularly.
Absolutely. And part of that too is you've got to have the visualizations where you can actually show this kind of things. What we did is we actually gathered some of these data to show this actual scenario in a dashboard where you can use real software to demonstrate this stuff without having to, take months to go gather this data and prove your case. You can create these things on a real-time basis where you can, as you've got all the systems integrated and data being correlated, now you can offer this out to management and to different teams and say, hey, look, you're not going to hold the release hostage. We're going to get these things out in a higher quality. We'll put your release off on a different train. Because we manage the entire release process, you can now coordinate those features and dependencies and separate them out as necessary so that you can get the right sets of functionalities through. And that's really where the value comes in of transforming the way you're doing it, combined with the metrics and the measured outcomes of the process. The next step of this, of course, is optimizing the entire value stream, looking at some of the key metrics that are critical for delivery. Things like, how long does it take us in each phase of development? What are the processes and things that we go through, and what are the shortest and fastest times that we get there? Looking at these things, you can start to see where, as you break these scope of works down into smaller and smaller units, you can start to see those practices and teams that are moving faster and those that are sort of stuck. And those that are stuck look at being able to provide the kinds of metrics to push and promote the organizational and cultural change into more agile and DevOps kinds of practices, because now you'll have the metrics of the teams that are working well, and you'll also be able to point out the laggards and knuckle draggers that are just not getting there, and find ways to dissect and transform their systems and processes. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we all want to deliver faster, and we all want to deliver higher quality. And in order to do that, you absolutely have to have the data that you can transform into contextual insights, and contextual insights that allow you to drill into the data and, like I said, follow your nose through it so you can gather and transform these things. This is exactly what we do at Plutora, is we help you gather these things and manage your delivery process and manage your transformation process. We've been doing it for a number of years and have got a lot of really big customers that we've been doing it with that have enormous regulatory compliance with the likes of banks and healthcare, insurance, and so forth. We're able to provide all sorts of visualizations. There's really nothing that you can't do in terms of how you organize and configure that data. There's a new wave that actually Forrester has promoted that if you haven't read about this, it's called value stream management. It talks about, level upping the way that we're going about our transformation practice and looking at the way that we build software as a management of systems, so that we can get the visibility and the use those metrics to help us drive agile and DevOps practices. Plutora, we're actually one of the leaders in this space, and there's a lot of good things that we're doing because of that. Helping drive value stream management, manage the entire ecosystem of software delivery so that we can deliver faster and higher quality.
And for me, I've been trying to help as many people as I possibly can because of the types of benefits that this is delivered to me. I wrote the books we talk about. I do the webinars. I try to be as transparent as I possibly can be to show people how to do this and make it happen, because I'm a company of one. I can't be everywhere, and a lot of people can run with what's here and on themselves. In situations where you're saying the same things I might be saying, but it helps to have an outside authority come in and help with workshops. I provide two types of workshops. One's an executive workshops to really help the executives understand their role, help them understand the benefits that can be realized there and what can be accomplished. And I offer execution workshops, which are really an ongoing engagement with clients to do the upfront mapping, to get all the data, run a day-long workshop on site, and then do the remote on-call calls and coaching them through the transformation and helping as many people through this journey as I can. And by helping more organizations in different places, it puts me in a position to do that well. The next series on this webinar series is really bringing in one of my clients who I think's just done a phenomenal job in a very large organization of transforming how he does software development while holding down his full-time job and making it happen. And he's going to walk through the steps of how he used the principles and practices in my books to systematically walk through his team on a 2-year journey, and the monthly call-ins that we continually have on this journey, and the business results that he's been able to provide. And hopefully seeing that journey will enable you to understand what does one of these really look like when you've got a day job and everything else and you're trying to make it happen, and what are the types of results that are realistic that I can talk to my upper management about to get them to support and invest doing this type of transformation.
So with that, I guess we will open it up to some questions and see where it goes.
Fantastic, guys. Before we get to questions, let me just say, did not disappoint. Excellent, excellent. Really, really how to great information that I think people will find valuable. So thank you both, Jeff and Gary. First question comes from Sam. Do you find that breaking down the system deployment pipeline into subsystems that it requires more developers, or do you find that organizations are staffed sufficiently?
I think you can have the staffing, but you're going to need somebody to create that service virtualization. So you're either going to need to peel somebody off, or you're going to do it. But what you're saving is, that you'll see in Ted's presentation, is just the time and energy and resources that he used to put into debugging in that integrated test environment. So what we're trying to do is, yes, we'll need something to get kickstarted the improvement to start getting some benefits. But what we're hoping to do after that is we're trying to pick the changes in the order and the right process that'll free up capacity in your organization to enable you to invest more in sharpness.
I think there's something to be said too for the metrics there. If you go look at the amount of time that's being spent on inspecting the quality downstream and trying to verify over and over with every single build, especially as the number of iterations for those increase, it's very quickly relevant that, well, gosh, if we were able to automate this, we save time and improve quality and free our testers to do more, being like a product manager for test versus someone who's going to just go click the button.
And if you had the data to show that people are triaging in this end-game process, the hardening phase, they're triaging deployment issues 30% of the time. Do you think you could go to your boss and talk to him about we could free up, it's an invisible 30%, but we could free up 30% of this in-game time if we invested in deployment automation? And the same thing for environment. And those types of, it's the hidden costs in your organization that are associated with waste, which is really having to debug and triage things that aren't associated with code, but are associated with processes or steps in our manufacturing processes that can and should easily be automated. And you can use that data to justify the investments in really doing that automation.
Excellent. Guys, before we get to the next question, just want to quickly mention, I thought I did in the beginning, this webinar, like all DevOps.com webinars, is being recorded. Slides and the recording of which will be available via DevOps.com, usually within a couple hours, but I like to say 24 hours to give our team time to get it up there. So hopefully that answered a bunch of questions that are out. Next one is Eduardo. How much of governance is necessary to keep this process running well? And then how much of that governance can we automate or is automated?
Governance versus leadership. I think leadership is required if you have a large, tightly coupled system, looking over at the system and doing it. And then governance, I think a little bit of, once you have one of these up and running, and you'll hear Ted talk about this, it's such a breakthrough that it's a forcing function that automatically aligns your organization. So you need a little less of the governance, but if you're getting down into the separation of duties part and the idea that who approves stuff moving, when that becomes your bottleneck, which it isn't for most organizations, it's going to be your environment stability, your deployment stability, the amount of time it takes to run your tests, how much you're inspecting in and changing the behaviors of developers to bring code in without breaking existing functionality is usually where it lies. But if you get to the point where that time to approve is really your barrier, what you do is you go to the person who's doing the approval and say, what is the criteria that you use to approve this? And can we put that approval in the form of an automated test that enables our deployment pipeline to move fast while ensuring that the rigor that you feel needs to be in the process is in place? And that's how we do that for regulated environments where you want separation of duties and concerns. And you can build the governance in that way when you get to the point where that's the bottleneck. But a lot of people think, well, to do DevOps, I've got to start there and change that. And in reality, Goldratt teaches us to focus on the bottleneck, and any improvements in the bottleneck isn't going to change the process. And for most organizations, that approval process really is not yet the bottleneck, although it may be over time as you improve the rest of your deployment pipeline.
And this is where, tools like Plutora with our release orchestration can really help. We take the release and break it up into phases and gates, and those gates can be automated or manual. The best part about it is that you could look at your pipeline and see how much time is being stuck at a particular approval phase and what it's taking, and then that enables the conversation to go back to to the folks enforcing the governance there to figure out how can we root out that wait time, and how do we automate this, and commonly too find that when they're able to automate that, their checks are more rigorously followed and ensured versus just having a step there where somebody manually says, yeah, you're good.
And what's interesting, and one of the visualizations that we need to get as we think about across this, is where are lines of code stuck? In a manufacturing floor, you can see piles of inventory everywhere. With branching, or what I find in a lot of organizations is they don't even really start integrating and putting stuff together until they meet a milestone like functionality complete or dev complete. And I've seen some organizations that take 9 months to release, and they've created their quality bars so high that the teams don't really try to get through it except for a couple to 3 or 4 times during that release period. So you're never really putting anything together. So in reality, you're saying you have these quality bars, you're trying to get quality better, but what you're doing is building up massive amounts of inventory to assemble at the last final moment to build in quality through inspection and rework.
Huh. Excellent. Okay, next question we've got from Leon. Wondering, as fixing deficits, I wonder, as fixing deficits rise, at what point does it get reclassified as rework?
I'm not sure I understood the question very well, Alan.
Well, I think there was a little bit of a typing mistake, and I was trying to correct it on the fly. I apologize. I guess Leon's wondering, as we are fixing more deficits, right?
Right, more defects.
Or defects, excuse me, I said deficits. Hello. As fixing defects rising, as fixing defects rise, at what point does it get reclassified as rework? So I guess the real issue is, how do we classify fixing defects versus rework? Does that make sense?
I guess I think of it in terms of software is still a creative process. You got people doing it in their minds, you got them figuring out, you got them doing that sort of stuff. They are going to do things that have unintended consequences, and I don't think we're ever going to change that. What we can do to improve the productivity and effectiveness of them is provide them that feedback as real time as possible. And if we can do that in terms of automated tests that gate their code, they can check in their code, see if it passed. If it doesn't pass, they can fix that real time, and they can learn from it, and they can learn how to get better before they spend a lot of time on code that won't work in the broader system. So is that eliminating defects? No, I think, but it's accelerating learning, and it doesn't have the overhead associated with logging a defect, closing a defect, and managing and tracking defects. We're statistically managing stability with our test passing rates on our automated tests, and we're improving quality by putting gates in the system that people are going through on an ongoing basis every day to try to get their feedback from the broadest view of the system as they can.
Excellent. Okay. You know what, guys? We're just about at the top of the hour. Gary, Jeff, again, thanks for a great webinar, guys. I found this one really interesting and really informative and helpful. I'm sure our audience did as well. And for those of you who maybe weren't lucky enough to join us live and are listening to a recording of this, we hope you get as much out of it as our live audience did. Gary, I know you're working perhaps on some new books, and always something good coming, going on with you. We hope to hear more about it soon. Jeff, you know, what can I say? Plutora is a real power in the value stream management space, and we love, you know, hearing more about what you're learning and talking to your customers and in the market, and that's the way we learn as well. So thank you very much, both of you, and thank you very much to our audience for joining us today. Have a great weekend, everyone. This is Alan Schimmel, and we'll see you soon on another DevOps.com webinar. Bye-bye.